So I want to welcome you all to our first Epicenter training, weekly training session. And this week it's going to be on the topic of intermediate Excel techniques. And I made the assumption that all of you have used Excel before. It's pretty much a tool that everybody uses. And if you think about it, it's a tool that, we use for just about every project. Use it for storage analysis and capacity analysis, and it's pretty much ubiquitous. And if you think about it, there's certainly different levels you can use it in, and I think a lot of people use it on a very basic level. When I started doing spreadsheets back in the late 80s, mid 80s, there wasn't a lot you could do. You could add things, you could count things, you could add, subtract, multiply, and divide. But now there's so many different things you can do. The intent of this presentation is really to give you a little bit more of a deep understanding on some of the different tools and things that can be used. There's always multiple ways to do things, so we're trying to come up with just more complicated models, and spreadsheets kind of have opportunities to use better formulas and things. So this is just a quick agenda. Can you all see my my screen here?
Yep. Yes, I can see you too.
All right, good. So we're basically going to just review some of the common Excel formulas with examples. So I have a spreadsheet. I will be putting that spreadsheet in the box.net so you have a copy of it. But it kind of goes through some of the basic tools, and of course there's other things we're not going to cover. And then my thought is we can have some open discussion afterwards if you have any questions, and then we'll just do a wrap-up real quick. So what I want to do first then is I'm just going to go into Excel here. And I put together this spreadsheet, and I have different tabs here. There's a math, statistical, if, pivot, etc. And, I'm not sure how much you guys use some of the advanced things, but if you go into Formula tab, this I believe is 2000, I don't know what version I'm using here, it might be 2010. You'll see that there's a lot of different categories for formulas or functions. There's a financial, there's a logical, deals with, false and if, ors, and things. There's a text one for dealing with text, date and time, lookup and reference, math and trig. And there's a whole bunch of these more functions. There's statistical functions, different types of engineering functions. Some of these you don't use very often. I do use the information one sometimes. So there's a whole wealth of functions, and I like to sometimes, when I'm starting a big project, kind of review them and see what there is, because for any one of those functions, if I click on a text function, it gives you information here about what that function does. And also there's a help that Microsoft Office is pretty good. They'll have help in here, and they'll give you examples of how to use that function. There's certainly lots of help that's available out there. And it will even help you if you started to fill in a function. It will help you kind of fill it in. So I always think I'm going to try the function and see what result I get and compare it to what I should have gotten. And that's how I kind of verify that it's working the way I expect it to work. So let's just kind of go through some of the general ones here. So here's some different math functions that I find helpful. And I'm not sure how many you've used, but here's an example for SUMIF, which is a sum with condition. And so if I have a list here with a person in one column and a time in another, and you can see I have the person's name and I have the time in the second column. And down below I've used a formula, SUMIF. And what SUMIF says is, all right, I want you to look at a certain range, and you're looking at the range of values that you're looking at for your criteria. So in this case, I'm looking at, the criteria is going to be the name I want to look at. So that's the first part of it. And then I put a comma, and then the second part is what I want to make my criteria. Now, if you set it up right, you can put the criteria right in this column. So if I had one that was Dan as my criteria, I'm using this column as my criteria, then it allows me to I can just type in what I want and it will tell me. In this case, it's summing them up. So you're putting in where you're looking, the criteria, and then what you want to sum. This is really handy if you have a list of, oh, I see Cindy arrived. You have a list of values, and at the bottom you just want to sum up how many there are. Another one is COUNTIF. COUNTIF is similar, but for COUNTIF you don't have to give the last argument because you're not summing them. You're just going to count how many there are. So it's just equals COUNTIF, and then you're putting in the criteria range, and then you're putting in the criteria. So in this case, the criteria range is this right here, and the criteria is this column here. And you can see if I copy it down, I can make, again, I can just copy the formula down and it always looks to the left for the criteria. We've used these before when you want to add up how many hours somebody's scheduled to work in a week, because no matter where the values are in that list, it will find them and it will add them up at the bottom. Another one that's a little more tricky is called a sum product. And what a sum is, it will multiply two different columns. So in this case, I want a sum product. I want to add up the values in H times the values in I. So this is like a weighted average. So Bob's time is 1, and we give him a 40% weight, and Bill's is 2, and I give him a 50% weight. So if I add all those up, I get basically a weighted average of 9.7. Here I've multiplied them. This is the manual way you could do it. You just multiply them together, and then you add them up. So again, it takes one of these steps away in this case. Does that make sense to people? Some terms you should know. Absolute value, there's an ABS to do absolute values. Integer will always truncate down to the nearest integer, and round always rounds to the number of digits. Some pretty simple formulas. And down here, here's some interesting formulas. Ceiling and floor. What ceiling will do is we'll round up to a multiple of a significant value. So here's some examples. So in this one, Michelle's time is 5.6. I want to give it a significant of 1.0. So the ceiling in this case is 5. It rounds it up. Basically what it's doing is it's doing it in this level of significance. So if my level of significance for this Bill example here was 25, you'll see it rounds up by the 25. So it's like a factor. So imagine you were doing a storage analysis and you knew that every pallet had 480 units on it, and you want to know how many pallet spaces you need. Well, if you did this, then this is the number you'd actually store, because you'd have to round up to an even number of pallets. We can also do one called floor, and floor is basically taking it and it's rounding it down by the multiple. So in this case, Bob is 1.2. If I'm going to use a 0.5 significance, it's going to round down. If I'm going to use a 0.25, same thing. If I'm going to use 1.1 significance, then you can see how that affects the values. It's kind of a way to round down based on some significant value. Now, I don't know that you use these very often, but I bet you would use these quite a bit. SUMIF, COUNTIF, and sum product. Now, I think there's actually one now called, let me see if it's on here, SUMIF-F. Yes. There's some new in the new version of Excel. I wanted to use this for John Mambo, but I couldn't. In the new version of Excel, you can add an S to the end of this, and you can actually do multiple criteria. So, for example, if you wanted to pick people whose name is Bob that are greater than 25 years old, you could have another column. You could pick Bob and then the age, and it would use multiple criteria to come up with that, the values to summarize. So, like, for example, you could say, I want anything that's for this product that's in this month, and basically it goes around and adds all of them up. So it can be very, very handy. Now, you can do that manually by setting different ranges and doing if statements and stuff. But again, this is another way of doing it without having to do manual. These are statistical ones. This formula is called a frequency formula. And so if you can imagine, you have scores and you have bins. These are different bins. With this, you can, if you go into it, it's like you have so many bins, and everything has to fit into one of those bins, and we'll tell you how many fit in each bin. That's what this formula does. Now, this one, and gosh darn it if I forgot to do it, but this is what's an example of a range formula. So you can see how there's these little brackets here. These brackets, when you do the formula, you actually have to highlight a range when you create the formula. And gosh darn it if I can't remember how to do that. I should have looked that up beforehand. But if you look up range formulas, when you paste the formula, you have to paste it. You have to actually be highlighting a range when you make it. This is a simple min and max formula. It just does the maximum or minimum of those values. This is an example of how you could use the max formula to automatically number lines. And essentially all I'm doing, anytime I have a space, I have it in the formula. If this is a space, then nothing. Otherwise, take the maximum number of all the ones above it and add 1. So if I put anything here, you can see it now added that value in. And I've anchored the top. So as I drag this formula down, it always just expands that range. So you can see. Again, you can certainly do this manually, but this is just a way to create more of an automatic way of numbering things. This is an example of if. I use this formula all the time. So if I want to add up cumulative hours by person, and I use this if statement, I say if, and then parentheses. I say if this value is equal to the value above it, then if I look at this value and it's greater than 2, take the value of this and add it to the value above. And you can see it added it. Otherwise, if it's not greater than 2, I don't want to add it. Otherwise, if it's not the same person, I go ahead and I just take whatever the value is. So by using this formula, essentially what it does is it will add up the values until it gets to the end of a person, and then it restarts. So you can see here, so if Annie actually started here, you can see how that adjusts the formula, looking at these values. And then all I do over here to put the totals in the next other column is I say if this one is not the same as this one, then take whatever this value is here and bring it over. And that's how I create this over here in this column. So this would be a manual way of using if statements in order to do this cumulative and totals. But if you remember from the first tab, we also could use SUMIF. So here's how you do the SUMIF. SUMIF says, I want a SUMIF, and I look at this is my criteria range here. This is the criteria. Bill is my criteria cell. And then what I want to sum up these values. So again, you get the same result, but in this case, you're just using a SUMIF versus having to do all this other stuff. Here I've got the OR statement. What OR does is the logic statement, and essentially you can use it in an if statement. If, or, then we'll take a series of things. So in this case, if G5 is equal to Bill, or H5 is equal to 2, or I5 is equal to yes, then put yes, otherwise hit no. So it will look at any of these. They don't all have to be the same, just one of them. So if I made this Dan 1 and no, then that would be no because none of them are true. The and, the similar, but the and, all of them have to be true. So this is if and this equals Bill, this equals 2, and this equals yes, then go ahead and put a yes here. Otherwise, put a no. So again, it's another way that you could use some logic and say if certain criteria are true in this row, go ahead and do this calculation. Otherwise, do a different calculation. Any questions on that? these are pivot tables, and pivot tables are great because it's a way for you to automatically take information and put it into a table that summarizes it. And the way you make a pivot table is you highlight the range, including the type, the top, which is what it is. And ideally, you'd like all these to be different names. Like this is person, hours, date, and comment. You highlight the range you want to make a pivot table on. You hit Insert, and then Pivot Table. It wants to know whether you want a chart or a table. We're just going to make a table. We've already selected the range, and we're going to go ahead and put in the existing worksheet, and we'll put it right here. And I hit OK, and then you can see it's brought up the field list. So in this case, if I want to total it by person, I might put person here. I'm going to put in, I want to be doing something with values, in this case the hours, so I put those in values. And what it will default to is summing up the values, but I could also count the values, or I could actually drop in a couple of these, and I can change it. So maybe I call this count of hours, and that would be a count. So I've got a sum, and I have how many times it occurred. And then if I want to put it by date, for example, I might make the column labels equal to the date. So what you can see here is I've created a pivot table here. It takes the date and the person's name, and it's giving me two values. It's giving me a sum here, and it's giving me a count over here. Now the other thing I can do is I can also filter it. So if I go to Filter, I have a filter by person here. So if I click on it and I say, I just want to see Bill, then now it just gives me bills. If I want to see Bill and Annie, now it gives me Bill and Annie. So it allows you to basically adjust your range of what you want to look at. I use pivot tables all the time. And you can reference pivot table values, and you can also copy them over as a hard value if you want. So those are pivot tables. Pivot charts are similar, except not only does it create the pivot table, but also links it to a chart. So if you wanted to graph it, it's a quick way to do it. Now, I don't think that you would know how to do this by my little example here, but I think what I would suggest to you is that you go in and, knowing that this is available, go in and play around with this. Will allow you to try it, and you'll see right away, that's the beauty of it. If I do change something, and now here I have a filter by date here, so I can see right away the impact of changing things on my pivot table. And by experimenting, you can start to get an understanding how there's lots of things you can do with pivot tables I haven't even shown you. The point is, I would go in and play around with it and experiment, because this is a very powerful tool, these pivot tables. Another tool that's available for Excel is lists. Sometimes they're called filters also. So if I go into the data here, this would be your normal table that you'd have. Just basically a regular table. If I want to create this into a list, I click on here under Filter, and now what it's going to do is it's going to allow me to filter by any one of these. I can also do sort. So if I just want to see Bill, I can click on Bill, and it basically just shows me Bill. It's a way for me, again, to slice and dice information. Now, yeah, I'm a great guy, and Dave's highly technical. And the other thing is, if I wanted to put values in here, it only puts them in. I can even copy them down. It only applies to the things that are showing. So if I unfilter it, you can see it's put the ones in. It skipped all these other ones that were hidden. Not only are they hidden, but they don't count. So you can copy formulas and stuff using this format. You can also do sorts, smallest to largest. You can put in different filters. There's lots of ways to slice and dice information. Again, if you want to turn off, you can unclick filter, and it'll let you turn off, and it basically goes back to a regular old table. There's also some formulas called dsum. It's another way of, I think the one we talked about before was SUMIF. There's a database formula called dsum. And what dsum does is you select a range of values. You put in what the criteria is, in this case hours, and then you can basically get to find where that criteria range is. So in this case, I can change the criteria range in a value, and it will have an impact on the result of the formula. Again, just another way of slicing and dicing using databases. I tend to not use dsum too much. I tend to use SUMIF instead. Here's a nice little spreadsheet I put together once using conditional formatting that creates a automatic Gantt chart. So if I change these, this was from 2006, so if I make this, for example, November 7th, you can see, well, let's make this 13. It will adjust the Gantt chart to match these dates. And the way it does it is through the use of conditional formatting. So what I've done is I've said, okay, if this value in this row, and it's anchored, so it always looks at that value, if that value is greater than the value in column D, which is this value, then I know that I'm not going to put anything here. However, if it's less than, then I look at the second criteria and say, well, if the value in the next cell is less than or equal to this, I also don't want to put anything. So in other words, I'm taking care of anything that's bigger or smaller than my value. And otherwise, I put an X there. So what you don't see here is there's actually an X sitting on this range. You can't see it, though, because I've made it, why can't you see it? Boy, I really have done a good job. I think I've made it hidden so you can't see it. But the conditional formatting can, and if I go into my formatting, you can see I said if the cell value equals X, then go ahead and make this red. And so essentially what happens is it's placing an X in these cells, and then as soon as it does, it makes it red, because that's what the conditional formula says. These ones down here, the conditional formula is blue. So again, if I go up to conditional formatting, manage rules, you can see I've set it to blue. And I can edit these rules. I can create new rules. Essentially, I just highlighted that range, and I gave it a conditional format to say if there's X in that cell, go ahead and make this blue. It probably makes the text hidden, too. That's how it works. But anyway, it's a nice little way of making a Gantt chart. And in fact, this Wyman project that I mentioned earlier, that's the thought, is that it would be done. They actually use this formula that I created for them when they do their planning for their facility. The last little section I want to go over is text functions. And this is an example of the left, right, mid, and find values. And you can see, so here's the text. This formula takes the left 5 characters. So it's a way to parse things out. This takes the left 5, this takes the right 5, and this takes basically the middle, and it starts at value 6, and it does 5 characters. Now, sometimes you have to separate things out. It's useful to know where certain values, to find the U in the statement starting at the first character. And if there's a U somewhere in this text string, it tells me where it is. In this case, the U is in the 10th location. This is the 7th location. You can see if you count over here. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 is where it is. And then what this one does is it's looking for this value nuts that I've placed up here, and it's looking for that U basically. So I'm sorry. in this case, it's not looking at this value. It's basically just looking for the word nuts, and it tries to find it. So if I'm looking for the word sir, it found it. The word sir is actually sitting in this here. Or if I'm looking for the word Excel, you can see this one actually found it. Again, it's another way to find words and things in text strings. There's a lot more I could go over, but our time is pretty much up. And I think what I got out of this is the idea that, you know, there's a lot of things that you can do with Excel, and you know, it's like having a toolbox at home. If all you have is your screwdriver, your hammer, and a crescent wrench, you're really limited in what you can do. It might take you forever to disassemble or assemble something. So the more tools that you know about that you can use, the easier sometimes it is to do things. And I would challenge all of you to look at how do you expand your toolbox in Excel. How do you take something you do now that takes 3 steps. Every time you see something that takes 3 steps to do, how do you look at, well, how could I do that in 1 step or 2 steps? Do you have any questions?
No.
I don't.
No.
Was there anything that you got out of this you weren't aware of that you think will be helpful for you going forward?
I think so.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Again, it's. I'm going to go ahead and post the spreadsheet on our website, box.net folder, and certainly you're welcome to play around with the formulas. And there were some things on there I didn't even get a chance to cover. So feel free to call me if you have any questions about how to use formulas, or if you have something that you're trying to do and you're not sure if there's a formula for it. We'd be happy to go over that with you.